I'm reminded of a book that I recently rediscovered during these last few months, written by the famous author Shel Silverstein, called The Missing Piece. And no different than his other children's books like The Giving Tree, The Missing Piece is able to communicate an incredibly profound message. And the story is about a circle that is missing a wedge-shaped piece. Imagine, if you will, a Pac-Man type figure. And so unhappy to be missing its piece, this circle sets out to find it. And as it rolls along, it sings this little refrain as it enjoys all of the scenery along the way. And the circle says, "Oh, I'm looking for my missing piece. I'm looking for my missing piece. Hi-de-ho, here I go. I'm looking for my missing piece." And Silverstein writes that because he's missing a piece, the circle actually can't roll very fast. And so he stops and he chats with the worm, or he smells the flowers, or rolls past the beetle. And these kinds of moments happen to be the happiest for the circle. And after encountering various pieces of different sizes along the way, only to find that none of them are the right fit, and he finds at long last the exact sized wedge that fits it, and is so happy. Now the circle has found what it's missing. It can finally roll along quickly. And yet at that exact moment, the circle realizes that it can now no longer do the things that it used to enjoy so much, like singing or rolling slowly enough to enjoy the company of the worm or a butterfly. And so the circle decides that it was actually happier when it was searching for the missing piece than now when it actually has that piece. And so it gently puts down that piece and happily goes along its way. And I find myself drawn to this story in particular this year, as it feels as if our lives have never been more broken. How it feels as if we are missing something, how we are missing a piece that is so significant, a real sense of loss that we are searching for and all trying so desperately to fill. Now, I realize that some of you might be thinking, not me, I'm not broken, nothing that bad has ever happened to me, or even though maybe I've experienced some difficult moments, I wouldn't consider myself to be broken. But the truth is that all of us experience this notion of brokenness at different points of our life. And when I say brokenness, I really mean any kind of loss, any kind of pain, struggle, or even disappointment. It could be the loss of a loved one, whether recent or maybe even decades ago. It could be strained relationships, loss of a job or physical possessions, or maybe even of hope. It could be rejection. It might be divorce or separation, the burdens, perhaps, of attending to one's own family and to aging parents, or the pains and challenges of aging itself, or maybe being worried for our children and our grandchildren and their futures. And sadly, often the most painful, broken places are hidden ones that only a small group of people know and hold in their hearts. Pregnancy loss, infertility, struggles with mental illness, or maybe even chronic disease. And some of us are able to move on from those moments quickly, and for others in the same or different situations, it might even take a little bit longer. Some of us might feel fine one day, and the next day that old wound just rips open all over again. And each one of us carries these burdens. We're all fractured. And on Rosh Hashanah, we are reminded of this brokenness through the sounds of the shofar. Tekiah, a whole sustained blast, followed by the shavarim, a blast of 3 broken notes, and the trua, a series of shorter, broken staccato notes. And the Gemara teaches that the sound of the trua and the sound of the shavarim are meant to sound like a yavava. It's meant to sound like crying when we blow it. In fact, the Hebrew word shever actually means broken and shares the same root of the word shvarim. And we find this idea elsewhere on Rosh Hashanah. Think, if you will, to the second part of the Natana Tokef prayer. And after we ask the difficult questions about man's fragility, which this year more than in years past really resonates so deeply with all of us, of who will live, who will die, who by water, who by fire, who by plague. And we describe just how fragile and just how broken the human condition truly is. We are like cheres hanishbar, we're like shattered pottery, chatzir yavesh, we're like withered grass, ruach no shavet, a blowing wind, and kechalom yauf, a dream that just flies away. And in truth, there's actually very little space for brokenness in the culture in which we live in. The role models that we see on TV, that we see in our culture, they're all picture perfect, they're carefully crafted, they're airbrushed celebrities. What we see on social media, it can be so damaging and harmful because it removes and it hides away all of the brokenness. And yet, unlike the culture of today, our Jewish tradition sees brokenness in a completely different way. As the great Hasidic master, Rav Menachem Mendel of Kutz, was famous for saying that there is nothing as whole as a broken heart. The world as God created it was broken, and as we know, in need of our repair. Brokenness we know to be a fabric of life woven into the human experience of the world, with none of us immune to it. But for us as Jews, it's not just that we learn to accept it, but rather our tradition teaches us to lovingly cherish it and also to embrace it. Think back, if you will, to one of the most important moments of all time, the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. And if you think about it, it is a story of imperfection, a story of moral collapse, and specifically of brokenness. After spending 40 days and 40 nights with God receiving the Torah, when Moshe comes down from the mountain, he's carrying the luchos, he's carrying the 2 tablets of stone. And he looks down and he sees the people dancing and they're worshiping the Egel HaZahav. They're worshiping the golden calf. And when Moshe sees the Egel, his rage, he takes and he shatters the luchos. And Chazal, our rabbis, they ask a most fascinating question. They wonder, whatever happened to those broken pieces of the first set of luchos? Whatever happened to those tablets? We know that during this time period right now, culminating in Yom Kippur, that Moshe was receiving a second set of tablets. But whatever happened to the shards, to the broken pieces of that first set? And the Gemara in Bava Basra teaches us that luchot v'shivrei luchot munachim ba'aron, that the broken pieces along with the second intact luchot, they were both put together into the ark, into the aron. The Jewish people, wherever they would journey, would carry both sets, the broken and the whole. Think for a moment what it must have been like to collect those broken shards representing the worst sin in all of Jewish history, the shame, the embarrassment, the sense of loss. And yet, those broken pieces were treated with the highest level of respect and care. And unlike in today's society where we would have likely just tossed away those broken shards, or maybe we would have buried them the way that we do other holy items, these pieces instead are placed in the most holy, the most sacred of spaces. Our rabbis are teaching us that we don't have to bury, that we don't have to cover up or throw away our broken pieces. We need to cherish them. We need to appreciate them for what they are, which is integral to who we are as people. Both wholeness and brokenness exist side by side in the holiest of places. We have spent the last 6 months like the circle from Shel Silverstein's story, in search of our missing broken pieces. We've been trying to find it, praying for a vaccine to fill in the missing parts so that we can just keep on rolling as swift as we ever did before. We have been unwilling. We have been uninterested in accepting our brokenness and seeing the opportunities that it has created. We long for a return to how things were, as if things were so perfect before. We are praying for an end and, in a sense, praying to be whole again, instead of appreciating how this is asking us to grow and how this experience is making us stronger. Instead of yearning to be whole and to keep rolling at a breakneck pace like before, we need to follow in the footsteps of all the many people who have accepted their brokenness and rediscovered important values like community, like family, like friends, learning, exercise, trying new things, spending more time outdoors. And despite the pain of this sense of loss, life continues, albeit differently than before. Each of us, we all move through life with both sets of tablets, the broken and the whole. There can and there will be times of joy encased in that same box in our hearts. And like the shofar that takes us from wholeness with the tekiah and continues with the brokenness of the shivarim and the trua, and yet eventually returns to a wholeness more complete than before with the tekiah gedola, the broken and the whole are always side by side. And this brokenness, it shouldn't depress us, but rather we should look at it as a challenge for each and every one of us to move forward. Because for once we can accept and cherish that which we are missing, then the opportunities for fulfillment, for joy, for meaning, no different than the circle, then they can truly be appreciated. In fact, the Medrash teaches us on a pasuk in Tehillim, Amar Rav Alexandri, that we might have considered it an embarrassment to have to make use of some broken tools. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not that way. Not only is God's work always done with broken implements, God's best work is done with broken tools. And it's no different. There's a Japanese art form known as kintsugi, where broken pieces of pottery are put back together with gold. We too can create an even stronger, more beautiful piece of art when we embrace our brokenness and when we embrace our imperfections. As we say in Tehillim, Karov Hashem lemishberei lev, that God is close to the brokenhearted. And perhaps it is that when our hearts are broken, we can actually be a lot more spiritually open than ever before. We can be more appreciative of the blessings in our own lives, and we can really feel God's presence. And not only does Rosh Hashanah help us acknowledge our own impermanence and our fragility, but it's also a time to remember our strength, to remember our resilience, to remember our capacity to rebuild ourselves and to continue living fully, risking brokenness and living meaningfully, knowing that life is impermanent, but we are strong. There's a famous story that I want to conclude with about the Baal Shem Tov, who asked one of his senior students, named Rabbi Zev Kitzis, to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And he instructed his student to study all of the kavanot, all the Kabbalistic meditations that pertain to the shofar, so that he should meditate on them while he was blowing that shofar. And so Reb Zev took this immense responsibility. He took it so seriously. He studied and he worked so hard. He even prepared a little cheat sheet, if you will, a little piece of paper with all of the main points of each of these kavanas so that he could refer to them when he blew the shofar. And finally, the great moment arrived. It was the morning of Rosh Hashanah, and Reb Zev, he stood on the bima in the center of the Baal Shem Tov's shul amidst a packed house. And when the moment arrived, Reb Zev reached into his pocket, but there was no piece of paper. He couldn't find it. It was nowhere to be found. And he realized in that moment that he couldn't remember even a single word of those mystical formulas that he had just written down. And exactly at that moment of terrible realization and despair, the Baal Shem Tov calls out, Tekiah! And it's time for Reb Zev to blow the shofar. And Reb Zev stood there not knowing what to do. And so in his hopelessness, he just blew all of the shofar blasts the best way that he thought he could do it. A tekiah, a shavarim, a trua, a tekiah gadola. And when he finished, he stood there and he was crushed. He had tears streaming down his face. And the Baal Shem Tov comes over to him with tears on his face as well. And Reb Zev begins to apologize for failing so terribly. He feels so bad. And the Baal Shem Tov, he interrupts him and he says, "You don't understand. You didn't fail. You see, my friend, in the king's palace, there are many gates and there are many doors. And they lead to many halls and to many chambers. And the palace keepers, they have these great rings holding many keys, each which are actually opening different doors. But there's one key that fits all of the locks. A master key that opens up every single door. And the mystical kavanot, the Baal Shem Tov explained, those are keys unlocking each and every door to our soul, helping access more chambers. But there's one key that unlocks every single door, that opens up for us the most innermost chambers of the divine palace of the Almighty. And that master key, it is the broken heart. Friends, sometimes those moments, days, and even months of uncertainty and despair like we have experienced this year are our most real, our most open, and the closest that we actually can feel God's presence. The high holidays today, it begs us to face head-on the reality of our brokenness so that we might eventually find our way towards contentment and peace as we accept those pieces and gently place them in our own ark. And as we contemplate our losses and what we leave behind in the past year, we must also consider all the things that we've learned, what we might have discovered about ourselves, what new strengths we bring forward with us into the coming year. For in the words of Shel Silverstein, we know that we don't need to go looking for our missing pieces because God accepts our brokenness and He awaits our return beginning with this sweet new year. And so I wish you a Shana Tova from our entire family to yours. May this year be a year filled with blessings of good health and happiness, blessings of strength, acceptance, and courage in each and every one of our lives. Shana Tova.